So what we're going to do is we're going to always, every time we go over a certain system of the GI, for example, we're going to kind of go over a little bit in general today. I always like to recap the GI a little bit to give a good perspective to understand what it is entailed. Okay, so when we look at the GI itself, we want to understand that, for example, we got many systems involved. Now today in particular, our focus is the stomach. But I really want you to understand, for example, that the question that I have for each one of you guys is, where does all the digestive processes start? Does it start here in the mouth? Does it start in the stomach? Does it happen down in the liver, gallbladder area? Is it happen in the small intestine, the large intestine? Well, the one thing is that they all have a major part, but even step back when you look at the digestive tract itself. I believe that digestion even starts way before we even introduce anything into our mouth. We know that when we think about food, that we actually, it's one of our biggest emotional factors that we ever have in our life. We know that we crave foods. We know we think about foods. We do things on a daily basis. We smell foods, and it triggers a neurological response that can even start that whole digestive process that way. So let's look at, for example, like the mouth. As we know that, for example, that when we start here, we know that what happens there is our breakdown. But also too, we also have some of the processes happen where our body actually produces enzymes that way. Okay, our environment in our mouth, for example, is roughly around pH of, it needs to be more alkaline, between 7 and 7.4. But also too, it produces enzymes like alpha amylase, and its main job is to break down carbohydrates within the mouth. See, some of the things that we look at foods today, you're going to find out when we go over the stomach, some of the major attributes of the stomach, people get confused. Just like the mouth. The mouth actually has alpha amylase that does a wonderful job of starting us breaking down carbohydrates way before it even hits into the stomach that way. So as you see, for example, we have a lot of glands, a lot of salivary glands that can produce things, and we know that chewing, for example, has to be at a critical point because we have to take those macronutrients and start breaking down the micronutrients. And believe it or not, that's pretty much the definition of digestion, is where we actually break down macronutrients into micronutrients so they're allowed to be absorbed. Now, the absorption happens when we move across that intestinal lumen. But it really starts, for example, that digestive process where we start to break down macronutrients to micronutrients, start in that mouth. And of course, that we'll chew that thing up. We'll use all our glands to produce our enzymes that can now to start the breakdown and digestion of those, and absorption of those nutrients that way with the alpha amylase. But then, of course, obviously, it moves down to the esophagus. It moves down, and that's why it's very important as we chew our food to get it down into our stomach. Now, the overall viewpoint of the whole digestive system that way is to take us through that every part is very important. It's extremely important. Now, can we actually put food in our mouth and just not chew and swallow it and actually, have decent digestion? We can, because I believe that the parts that we're going to go over compensate for what we may have done. But there's certain organs in this whole digestive system that if it does not work almost perfectly, it really sets us up for every health condition on the planet. And I'm going to show you some very specific conditions that it deals with this way. So we know that we're gonna actually look at the GI series where I went over the mouth in great detail and going over all things. And that's why I said I always review what we've done in the past that way. But then I want to get to our main focus here, okay, which is the stomach. Now, Doran, as you can see in the GI series, we'll go over the gallbladder and liver. We'll go over the intestinal tract, the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum. We'll go over everything right down to the anus, where we actually understand, for example, its role and what happens and all the problems that go on there. But today, for example, as you notice, our focus is the stomach. It's one of my favorite focuses. It's one of the things that, for example, I think we don't really know enough about. Not as far as science. We know so much of how the stomach works, but we're always looking for these newest and best things. And we don't realize that with some basics that everybody can do will make a huge impact on overall health. Now, the stomach's main job, I think, is also too confused. But let's get a little bit more in detail into the actual structure of the stomach, and then we can actually start to understand what's its main role can actually be. So when we look at stomach, both the external and interior anatomy of the stomach histology, when we look at, as you see, we actually have, comes down, the food comes down the esophagus here. It moves into the cardia sphincter. Now, we're going to talk about that in great detail when we go through disorders, because this is one of the major sphincters that actually allows us to actually have some problems up into the esophagus and getting leakage into the hydrochloric acid going up there. But I want you to take, for example, a look at all the structures of the stomach. Let's take a look, for example, at all the musculature of the stomach here. Okay, we have longitudinal layers, we have circular layers, we have oblique layers. Now, what that really shows is the amount of musculature it takes in order to take that food that now has been started to break down and actually start to churn it and mix it together and allow it to actually go in all directions and tumble it. And think of it like being in a dryer. Okay, imagine if you have that front load dryer, and it's kind of neat because in our house we have these dryer balls to where you throw them in, and it helps pound inside the clothes to to allow it to actually get some wrinkles out that way. The nice thing is, for example, your stomach can actually push all of that food like those balls in every direction to actually create such a digestive process in there that allows you to do two major functions within that stomach. Now, this is where I really want you to think about. Now you say, Doc, when we look at the digestive tract, the main aspect is to digest food. You're right, I agree. But guess what? As you know, for example, the stomach produces two things. It produces hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Now, those are two chemicals that are produced for the breakdown and also to the absorption, and they allow things to actually, for the whole histology of all those stomach to work properly from a microbial standpoint, from a muscular standpoint, but also to it alerts when to open up, as you can see down here, that valve down below called the pyloric sphincter. Because now that stomach contents now move after it's been properly broken down, and properly, the key part that I'm going to hold for a second, the other key part, so now when it moves into the duodenum, that will now activate the gallbladder and liver and pancreatic response, which will now lead to perfect, in a way, just absorption. Now I want you to think about this. So we know that our body produces, our stomach produces hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. But what is really the main job? I want you to think about that. Because if we go back to our upper level here, and we look at the mouth, and the mouth produces an alpha amylase, which does break down carbohydrates. So let's say that every one of you guys are going to eat a salad. Okay, I'm going to take 2 seconds. I'm going to give you a 2-second commercial here to understand how I'm always going to clinically teach you guys when it comes to these webinars. In these trainings, sometimes I had a great conversation with a doctor over the weekend, and I said, listen, you've got a great $200,000 education, but here's any school out there today. They give you a massive amount of information, and then you're supposed to go apply it to a clinical realm. That's why I tell people, that's why they call it clinical practice, because they don't know what to do. One of the problems I see with practices today is they're taking general information and trying to apply it and have no clinical application to it. So I'm always going to, in every one of these things, I'm going to bounce around and I'm going to be asking you questions because I want you to be able to take this information. So if it's Sunday night and you're listening to this training, that Monday you'll be able to apply it. Okay? So let's go back to this now. Let's look at the mouth. Okay? So we now have alpha amylase that you put a salad within, your patient put a salad in. Okay? Now all of a sudden, it's like, okay, we have that whole carbohydrate breakdown that could happen in the mouth if the food is chewed well enough that way. So then what's the purpose then when actually it's put into the stomach and there's some, not a lot, but there's some hydrochloric acid production? We don't really need it for breakdown. Yes, we do produce things within there to actually help break it down a little bit, but it's not its main job. See, its main job, believe it or not, is to sterilize that food. Now let me say that again. The main job of that stomach when it came to that salad was to sterilize that food, to create the environment from outside pathogens that we now know are everywhere. For example, we know that we can get E. coli from outside pathogen. Why? Because if the food wasn't cared for properly, guess what happens? It's going to actually, with all the farming process that we have, infections are very common in foods.